Hey guys, welcome back. Pastor Zach with the 8th installment of our Adult Sunday School class. This is the 4th video I think that we've done now since the lockdown began. And as you can maybe see, my hair is getting extremely long. I haven't been able to get a haircut. It just goes to show how long we've been here and how difficult it is being stuck in our houses for so long. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to sort of feel that itch. Like, when is this going to be over? It was, for me as an introvert, it wasn't the worst thing ever for the first few weeks, but now it's really starting to make its presence and its effects known. And so I'm looking forward to being back together. But along those lines, as you've probably heard, if you've read the latest weekly edition of the Orchard Weekly, Pastor Marcus sent out a letter talking about possibly reopening the church once, if and when, whenever the restrictions begin to be pulled back a little bit. And so we will probably begin to do multiple services on a Sunday, maybe even up to 4 services, 3 or 4 services, depending on what the restriction limits are, if it's 50 people, and so on. And so with that said, I was thinking about the future and where we want to go with this. Given that we're doing this thing online, and I know several of you are following along each week and are learning from what we're doing here still, I was thinking about maybe doing a class throughout the course of the summer, even if it's just on camera, or maybe, Lord willing, it could be in person. And one subject that I was thinking about doing next fall through our class, with doing a sort of longer extended class on, would be church history. And that could still work, but a book that I'm thinking about maybe doing for the summertime is a little book, or not a little book, an average-sized book called The Church by a theologian and historian named Gerald Bray. And it's a very good, broad introduction of church history from the beginning up till now. Gerald Bray is an evangelical, reformed Anglican, a British man, but often is living in the U.S. He kind of moves around, but he's very up to speed on what has gone on in the American situation of church history. But he's also an adept scholar of early church history and Reformation history. And so that book, as I've read through it, I think is a great introduction for any layman into the grand swath of church history. There's other books that he's written that are thick, inches thick. This one is a much more sized down, slimmed down version of some of those. And so I was thinking, if anybody would be interested in that, just let us know through a comment here on Facebook or YouTube, or you can just get back to me, email me, text me, let me know your thoughts on that and how you would feel about doing a book study together. And that would maybe look like reading 1 chapter every week. There's 7 chapters in the book with a good appendix about the church councils and confessions and so on. And so it would basically be 8 weeks of study. We could try to map that out throughout the summer and go through that this summer. So if you're interested, let us know. If you'd like to do something else, you can also comment on that as well. And so with that, we turn now to today's lesson, which you can see on top is called The Main Characters in Proverbs. The main characters in Proverbs. And so we have a very depressed looking jester, court jester, sitting in a chair. I wonder if his play went wrong, if his jokes were not well received and his funny acting was not laughed at. But it's a good picture of what a fool might look like. The fool will lead to a sort of depressed, lifeless state if he remains in his foolishness for too long. And so just a few quotes from the top here. The first one from Proverbs 1, 32 through 33 is this: "For the simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them." So you'll notice those 2 people there, the simple and fools. "But whoever listens to me," that is, wise people, "will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster." So we see 3 characters there that we're going to see them and a few more in the lesson below. But we see the simple, the fool, and the wise person. The next quote comes from Mark Twain. He says, "It is better to keep your mouth closed and let people think you are a fool and to open it and to remove all doubt. Just a pretty general quote about if you be quiet, people will think you're wiser than you actually are. So it may be better and may benefit you more to keep your mouth shut. And the third one, which I thought was very, especially in regards to the simple person, as we'll see below, a man who is empty-headed will end up wrong-headed. And so we often talk about being open-minded, but we should not be so open-minded that our brains fall out, right? We should have our minds bite down on truth and hold to truth. We should not be complete empty-headed people. We should be people who search and seek diligently for the wisdom of God. And so to that end, today, as you'll see, we're doing the main characters. And though we may have never noticed throughout the book of Proverbs, we are introduced to a cast of characters that appear and then reappear all throughout the book. Because of the similarity between some of them, like the fool and the simple person, it can be easy to read over them thinking that they are essentially synonymous words for the same person and that they can be used interchangeably to refer to this kind of person. While this may be true some of the time, it can nevertheless be helpful to understand that each character has a unique place within the book. Each character is seen to be living with varying levels of either wisdom or folly, and varying levels of joy, godliness, and virtue. Some have lots of those things, and some have exceedingly little. For this reason, I wanted to do a character study of sorts today. And those will not be like most other such studies that you might do when you study people or characters in the Bible. It's going to be a little bit different than that. And the reason for this is that the characters in Proverbs aren't actual people. It's very clearly not talking about a specific historical person. When Solomon mentions the fool, he's talking about foolish people, a certain type of people. So we can learn from these types how we ought to live and how we ought not to live. And as we'll find out, there are some types of people whose lives are very much worth emulating and striving for. And there are others whose ways of life ought to be avoided and steered clear of. So as this study will make clear, wisdom exists on a spectrum. And maybe it would be better to say wisdom exists on a continuum. Over the course of time, a foolish person can change his mind, mend his ways, and seek wisdom. But the reverse may also be true. You may start out as a simple person, so sort of a neutral person, and get increasingly foolish as you go through life. So you can be a fool and become wise. It can happen. But it can also be that you have some wisdom, but then you fall to be a fool. And a great example of this, of course, is Solomon himself, the ironic author of most of this book, known as a great wise man, but who ended up falling into foolishness later on in his life. And so to conclude our study today, then, after we look at these characters, we'll be asking two final questions. What can we learn from these characters? That's the first one. The second one is, according to Proverbs, what is it that separates the foolish from the wise? What makes the difference then in somebody's life between what leads them to foolishness and what leads them ultimately to wisdom? And why do some people then increase in their folly while others increase and flourish in their wisdom? That's what we want to know. What makes that difference? And so we'll start then today's lesson with looking at the fools. This is 4 different characters that I've gone through, and I've sort of categorized them as fools we find in the book of Proverbs. The first one is the simple person, the simpleton, you might say. The Hebrew word for the simple is petty, and is used to show that this type of person is gullible, easily seduced, and naive and silly. Generally speaking, the simple occupies the same place as the beginner, which is why we often see it paired with youthfulness throughout the text. A good example would be Proverbs 7, 6 through 9. This means that for most people, we all begin at a place of being simple. We're not exactly full-blown fools, right? But we have the capacity to become fools and possibly even scoffers, as we'll see, if we do not proceed with caution, seeking wisdom as we grow. So a basic, simple way of putting this is that young people, young men and young women, start out as a sort of simple person. And they can be naive and gullible often, and they can through this naivete and gullibility, they can be easily swayed and be easily twisted and turned to follow lives and lifestyles that aren't good for them, that will not lead to their blessing and to their benefit, their flourishing. And so that's sort of the story in Proverbs 7. It's a simple young man who is persuaded and seduced by the seductress, by the adulteress, and it follows her to Sheol, it says. And so it's somebody who's unthinking. They're not necessarily a complete fool, but they are beginning to make themselves a fool. So to illustrate this in terms that most young people would understand, and I realize that not all of you may get this, but it will still, I think, be helpful. We can make a comparison here to the world of Pokemon and to the evolution levels that most of the creatures exhibit. I'm old, so I grew up when I was a kid. I wasn't a huge Pokemon fan, but I did have a few of the cards and was mildly interested in it. And so I found some Pokemon characters from that very, very first generation, Generation 1. And so these creatures, as you can see, can evolve from one level to the next as they grow and develop their skills as they battle and so on. And so typically there's a threefold evolution process as seen in the diagram. So you have this little character, his name is Squirtle, cute little turtle guy. And then after he grows a little bit, he becomes a little bit more fierce. He kind of looks like he's a young buck teenager sort of guy, ready to fight, but not quite fully grown and mature. And then you have Blastoise. You do have Mega Blastoise, according to some people, but Blastoise is really the full progression of this evolution. And so it's the full-grown version of Squirtle. He's now got these blasters on his shell, and he's a big dude, and he's ready to inflict some damage on people. And so that's the evolution process, starting out a Squirtle, becoming a War Turtle, and then becoming Blastoise. So the main appearances that we see throughout Proverbs, and I won't read all of these, I'll sort of jump through some of them. The main appearances we see, there's more appearances. This is not exhaustive, but this is some examples of where the simple person appears. We've already read the first one, so we'll look to the second one, which refers to chapter 7 with the seductress. For at the window of my house I have looked out through my lattice, and I have seen among the simple, I have perceived among the youths, right, a young man lacking sense, passing along the street near her corner, taking the road near her house in the twilight, in the evening, at the night, or the time of night and darkness. So we see this simple person who is being easily tricked into doing something he shouldn't be doing. But there's an offer of wisdom also to this simple person. This comes in Proverbs 9, 4-6. This is wisdom herself speaking. She says, whoever is simple, let him turn in here. To him who lacks sense, she says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed. Leave your simple ways and live and walk in the way of insight. And so you see that the simple is invited. There's a full offer for him, but he doesn't take it. That's the problem. And so in the next verse, from chapter 14, we see the naivety and the gullibility, the gullibleness of the simple person. And it says this: the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thought to his steps. Right? So the simple just believes whatever he hears, but the prudent thinks about his steps. The simple inherit folly, the prudent are crowned with knowledge. Why? Because they don't just believe everything right off the bat. So the simple person is more willing to just listen and take somebody's word for it, whereas the wise person is a little bit more discerning and wants to really get to the truth and not just listen to what people are saying and take it at face value. So now we move to the next one, the fool proper. This is the actual fool, as we find throughout the book of Proverbs. So following the simple, the next level in the development of folly is the fool. There are 3 Hebrew words that refer to this person. The first 2 are kesel and ewel. I don't speak Hebrew. I never learned Hebrew in seminary, actually, so I don't know if I'm pronouncing those properly. But these 2 words are very similar in meaning to effectively highlight the fool's dull and stubborn posture towards wisdom. It is important to note, however, that this is not a matter of his mental capacity. So it's not about his smarts, but rather it's about his attitude or the position of his heart and his chosen outlook. It's a big part of it, his chosen outlook. Because he does not fear the Lord, he tends to think he is already wise, and he has no real desire for the long work and dedication it takes to acquire wisdom as he grows. And so his heart is not soft to God. He thinks he has all the right information about life. He knows how to live his life and how to make it a good life. And so he doesn't worry about the hard work it takes, but he just trusts himself and lives on his own whim. So thus, as Kidner tells us, Derek Kidner, one of the great commentaries on this book is written by Kidner, the real root of his trouble is spiritual, not mental. That's a huge key for something we'll get to later on. With this, we begin to see the connection between foolishness and disregard for godly morality. He doesn't care what God's way is. He only cares about what he thinks is right. The third word, which is nabal, and which doesn't really add much to the other two, given that it is only used 3 times in Proverbs, but we do see it sort of expressing a coarseness and his bad manners. Another word can be boorishness. He's just sort of, he stuffs himself. He's kind of like gross, and he's kind of enslaved to his fleshly desires and so on. And so the main appearances of the fool that we see can be seen below. We'll start with the one from chapter 10. Doing wrong is like a joke to a fool, but wisdom is pleasure to a man of understanding. And so the wise man takes pleasure in understanding, but the fool thinks doing wrong is just a joke. It's no big deal. He doesn't take it seriously. We'll skip down to 15:2. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly. And so the fools just love to speak their own foolish opinions. And so the boorishness that we've seen, or the bad manners, or sort of the sloppiness we see, is in the next one, chapter 17, verse 7. Fine speech is not becoming to a fool, still less is false speech to a prince. And so a fool doesn't speak finely, he speaks sort of sloppily. And so it makes me wonder if I'm a fool. Sometimes I speak sloppily. And then the last one, a fool does dumb things, and he does them over and over and over again. He doesn't learn his lessons because he's not discerning. So Proverbs 26:11, it says this: like a dog that returns to his vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. And that has been a very powerful lesson for me personally over the years as I've grown, not doing the same stupid thing over and over and over again. The next person in this evolution then is the scoffer. This is the full-blown, this is the blastoise, this is the full-grown fool. So the designation can be properly conceived as being the final part of the 3-part evolution process of foolishness. One may start out as a simpleton, then stumbles into foolishness, and then hardens into the scoffer. That is, one who mocks God and deliberately stirs up trouble and mischief. He may attempt to impress the impressionable to make his case known, but most discerning men can perceive his imbecility, his stupidity. Thankfully, though, his obstinance is not outside of the Lord's judgment. His stubbornness is not outside God's judgment. Proverbs 3:34 tells us, toward the scorners, that same word, the Lord is scornful. So towards those who openly mock and deride the wise and the godly, God will mock and deride and judge them. And so we need to be careful about not being the scorner, not being the one whose heart is hardened. And so we'll look at verse 9:8. B here. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. So if you try to rebuke and reprove and show the error of his ways to a scoffer, he will hate you. Another one, Proverbs 21:24. Scoffer, in quotes, is the name of the arrogant, haughty man who acts with arrogant pride. He's no longer just naive. He's no longer thinking it's all a joke. He thinks that his ways are right and that the ways of the wise are wrong, and he is arrogant and puffed up. And so Proverbs 22:10 tells us what to do with the scoffer. Drive out a scoffer, and strife will go out, and quarreling and abuse will cease. So the person who's scoffing is stirring up trouble. He's abusing people, and so we are told to drive him out. get him out, and that will cease. And so the final person under the designation of fools, it's not really necessarily a part of the evolution we've seen so far. It's sort of a different person altogether in this scenario. He's sort of a sideshow of his own, if you will. He's a good word for this, for the place he occupies would be the word tragic comedy, which is a word used in drama to refer to things that are sort of pitiful. You can mock them, but also if you feel a sort of sense of pity. So this person, the sluggard, is depicted as being literally hinged to his bed, unable to get up and get going. He's depicted as being cowardly and ultimately helpless. He is unable to actually help himself because of his serious laziness. And so he won't get started. And even when he does get started, he won't finish. He wastes his time, his strength, and his life. And so as we read these verses, we should feel mixed feelings of laughter on the one hand and pity. And so the perfect example is from Proverbs 6 through 11. We've already looked at this a little bit in our class on vocation and on work ethic, but this is worth repeating. Go to the ant, O sluggard, consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief, officer, or ruler, she prepares her bread in summer and gathers her food in harvest. How long will you lie there, O sluggard? When will you arise from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber and want like a blind man. So he's chained to his bed. He can't get up. He's not doing the work that he needs to be doing. And so want and poverty are going to come upon him like an armed man. They're going to hunt him down. The next verses really are really interesting and poignant. 12:27 says, whoever is slothful will not roast his game, but the diligent man will get precious wealth. So he'll kill his game. He'll go out and kill it, but he won't roast it. He just won't finish the job to be able to eat it. The next one, the desire of the sluggard kills him, for his hands refuse to labor. He has this desire, but he can't fulfill it because he's not willing to work for it. So this is a good lesson with kids. Are you willing to work for the things that you want? If you really want that new MP3 player, phone, Xbox, whatever it may be, are you willing to work for it? Your desire should drive you and motivate you to work. Proverbs 22:13, the sluggard says, there's a lion outside. I shall be killed in the street. So he's not willing to go out and do the hard work of defending people or himself and being courageous in the Lord, but he's a fearful little coward. And the last one, this is funny, I think, too. The sluggard buries his hand in a dish. It wears him out to bring it back to his mouth. So that's a pitiful note to end on for the sluggard. He's hungry, so he's digging through his dish, but he's just so tired and so lazy that he can't even bring it back to his mouth. He won't finish the job again. And so we are called not to be like the sluggard. So the next one, the fellows. These are the sort of people around us. These are characters that we see throughout the book of Proverbs. And so the first one we'll look at is the good neighbor. But it's important to know that the Hebrew word for friend, Ria, actually has a broader meaning than its English counterpart. And so the good neighbor, it's the same word, neighbor and friend, but it just depends on the context. And so as such, it can vary in meaning from the other fellow. This word Ria can mean the other fellow, sort of the neighbor, that person on the one end of the spectrum, and then something also like close friend on the other. The first meaning is akin to the use that Jesus employs in Luke 10:25 through 37, when he replies to the man who asks, and who is my neighbor? By telling the parable of the Good Samaritan to make the point that anyone ought to be seen as our neighbor, regardless of whether or not we know them or we knew them previously. So a helpful way of thinking through what the good neighbor is to think of one who is a good citizen, courteous in all their ways to those around them, considerate of their needs, and generally polite. This is how Proverbs beckons us to live in the world with those around us, even or especially when we don't know them personally. So this is really relevant for right now. Why are we staying in our homes? Why are we washing our hands? Why are we wearing masks when we go out? Maybe not all of you are. I haven't worn one, but I'm about to start. Why do we use hand sanitizer? Why do we keep our distance from people right now? Well, it's because we follow this principle of being a good neighbor. Right now, those sorts of practices are a way of fulfilling our calling as Christians to be good neighbors to those around us. We may not know them, but we're still called to be considerate and courteous and kind and polite to them. And so some verses we see that talk about this in the main appearances section are Proverbs 3:29. Do not plot harm against your neighbor who lives trustfully near you. So don't, if your neighbor's dog is barking, don't just be sitting there plotting how you're going to harm him and get back at him for his dog barking. He trusts you. He trusts you not to do that, and so we're called not to. Proverbs 11:12. Whoever derides their neighbor has no sense, but the one who has understanding holds their tongue. And so we should not just wear our neighbors out by deriding them, getting on their case for different things, or looking down on them. We should hold our tongue and learn to just pick our battles and to be quiet when we need to. That's part of wisdom. Proverbs 14:21, it is a sin to despise one's neighbor, but blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. So that's exactly that passage from the Good Samaritan. If we despise our neighbor by not helping them in their time of need, we have sinned, right? We have despised them by not doing anything. That sort of indifference is its own problem. But blessed is the one who is kind to the needy. So it's interesting to see neighbor and needy put together, juxtaposed here, and we're seeing that the neighbor in our life may just be the needy person we come across. Proverbs 25:7-9. What have you seen with your eyes, or what you have seen with your eyes, you do not bring hastily to court. For what will you do in the end if your neighbor puts you to shame? So don't just be so quick to drag your neighbor to court, to sue your neighbor, to bring up some sort of legal action against them. What if he puts you to shame? What if you find out at the end that you went to court too hastily? And so we shouldn't just be the kind of nagging neighbor around us to people who may be frustrating us or annoying us. We should be considerate as we live. And so that's what the good neighbor is all about. The next one, though, taking that same word, Rhea, it also can mean the good friend. And Proverbs has a lot to say about friendship throughout the book. And so I've written at the other side of the meaning range for the word Rhea is the person who is a good, close friend. It's interesting that a book about wisdom places such a high value on friendship, but it doesn't merely value friends as such. As Proverbs informs us and as experience proves, some friends that we have come across in life aren't the ones who will stick by our side. Though their fleeting presence in our lives can nevertheless be valuable for a season, it ultimately doesn't last. Sometimes this is a matter of consequence or geography. I've moved away from Florida now, where I went to seminary, and I haven't been able to be as in touch with those friends that I knew for those years of my life. I'm still talking to them occasionally, but it's not the same as it was. And so geography has sort of made that happen. And other times it is for sadder reasons, such as hard times. You have a fair weather friend who leaves when things get difficult, something bad goes wrong in your life. And so they head out. They don't want to be around for that. So Proverbs' take on friendship puts a lot of focus on three main features: the constancy of friends, those who are willing to stick it out; the candor of friends, those who are willing to be truthful and honest with you, especially pointing out things that you need advice on or you need to change, you need to improve at. And the final one is counsel, giving you advice for how to make decisions in your life. And so we need faithful, truthful, and helpful friends in our lives. And so in these ways, friends are true blessings in our life, living reminders also of God's friendship with us that he offers us to Christ, in Christ. This is why Jesus himself says in John 15:15, I have no longer called you servants, but now I call you friends. He calls his disciples friends, and through them we are friends of God as well. And so God is faithful, God is truthful, God is helpful and supportive of us, and he helps us in all of our decisions in life. And so this is what we can learn from our friends. So the main appearances here, Proverbs 17:17, a friend loves at all time, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. A friend loves at all times. And what it's doing here is comparing friend and brother, but it's also blurring that line between the two and helping us to see that friends who love at all times are, in their own ways, brothers born for times of adversity. But it can also mean actual biological brothers. Proverbs 18:24. One who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. So here we see biological brothers, but there's friends that can be even higher on that spectrum of closeness to us. Friends can be a great help to us. Proverbs 19:4. Wealth brings many new friends, but a poor man is deserted by his friend. So there we see the fair weather friend, the person who heads out and says, I don't want to be a part of this anymore, or you got too many problems. I can't take those problems on. Proverbs 27:6. Faithful are the words of a friend, or the wounds of a friend. Profuse are the kisses of an enemy. Right? So sometimes your friends are going to wound you. They're going to say things that hurt for you to hear. But it's the enemy who may kiss up to you, may suck up to you, may say things to make you blush and be excited about yourself, to catch you off guard. But friends, in their trustworthiness, are willing to say the difficult things. Are you willing to say the difficult truths to your friends? Proverbs 27:10. Do not forsake your friend and your father's friend, and do not go to your brother's house on the day of calamity. Better is a neighbor who is near, a friend who is near, than a brother who is far away. And so, again, that shows the relationship that friends can be closer than our biological relationships. And the last one, though it doesn't mention the word friend, of course, I think that is implied. Proverbs 27:17. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. And so, in this way, it's talking again about that candor, that honesty that friends can have, and sharpening intellect, sharpening thoughts, sharpening wills and souls as they push and encourage one another towards the Lord and to walk in holiness as they believe the gospel. So now we've looked at the fools, we've looked at the fellows, and now we can turn finally to the wise. We would be really missing something if we were to go through the main characters in the book of Proverbs and not mention the wise person. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't other characters, however. We've looked at some of those other characters, sons, daughters. We've looked at the seductress, for example, that pops up in chapters 6 and 7 specifically. We've looked at the good wife, the bad wife. We've looked at kings and queens, and so on. And so this isn't all the characters, but this is a lot of the characters we haven't specifically taken a moment to look at up until now. And so we'll finish here with the wise man. The final figure that we'll be looking at this morning is perhaps the most obvious of all, the wise man. This is the person whose guiding principle is humility and fear of the Lord, which provides them with the tremendous and rare freedom to listen, learn, empathize, to seek advice, to obey authority and emotions, which often results in devastation, disaster, and disarray. The wise man stands out as a beacon, the grand exemplar of what God's people ought to be striving after. Of course, in this sense, the wise man is a prefiguration then of the Lord Jesus Christ, who himself was the perfect embodiment of wisdom. This is what we've seen in Proverbs 8, but also in the New Testament, Paul calls Christ our wisdom. And so as those who live in this new covenant instituted by Christ, we look to him as our wisdom, knowing that in following him and giving our lives for him and walking in his ways, it's the only true path to real wisdom. And so doing so may be considered fully folly and foolishness in the eyes of the world, but we carry on undeterred. In this, we are to see the man of wisdom mentioned throughout Proverbs as he who ought to be emulated in every possible way. So the person in Proverbs, again, is picturing Christ, pointing us forward to Christ. And so we should emulate this wise person because we want to emulate Christ. So the main appearances in the book of Proverbs are chapter 9, verse 9, give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. So there's a sort of receptivity to instruction and to counsel and advice from others. He's willing to listen. Proverbs 12:15. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. So again, he listens. 15:33, the fear of the Lord is instruction in wisdom, and humility comes before honor. This is big. The fear of the Lord. Again, this theme pops up many times throughout the book of Proverbs. We're, of course, told in the opening lines in verse 7 of chapter 1 that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It's the starting. It's not just the beginning, though. It's also the end of wisdom. So this wise man, he fears the Lord, and therefore he is humble. And this humility comes before honor. As Pastor Mark said this morning, the humble man, the one who is full of humility, is exalted by God. Proverbs 21:20, precious treasure and oil are in a wise man's dwelling, but a foolish man devours it. And so the wise man, by being wise, working diligently, saving well, preparing well, he has oil and he has treasure in his dwelling and in his reserves. And so he knows how to manage his life well. 29:11, a fool gives full vent to his spirit. So he says whatever he's thinking, but a wise man quietly holds it back. He knows when to speak and when not to speak. And so what? That's the final question here. So what? So these two final questions that we've put, which you can see in red, are what can we learn from all these different characters? And so as with any story we read or we watch, we humans have the amazing propensity to place ourselves in the story and into the place of the characters we meet, not only wondering through how we would act in such similar situations, but also thinking through ways in which we might learn to emulate the good traits we see in them, as well as how to avoid the bad ones. So in reading through a book like The Lord of the Rings, we might find ourselves compelled by the loving bond of friendship personified in Samwise Gamgee, as we learn the lesson that great journeys are impossible without the support and guidance of faithful friends. On the other hand, we will likely take note of the enslaving lust for power that we see in Gollum, who was formerly Smeagol, and he is now the twisted and dehumanized former hobbit whose greed and lust for power have deformed him into little more than a shell of his former self. In him, we see an example of how not to live and why we ought to avoid the enslaving desires of the flesh which threaten to destroy us. So in the same way, we can and we should look to the characters of Proverbs, both for the good examples that they set, as well as for the bad ones. There is much to learn, and we might be helped if we asked ourselves penetrating questions, such as, am I a simpleton, a fool, or a scoffer? And why? So if you think that you're one of these, you ask yourself, well, why do I think that I'm one of these? Or maybe you could say, maybe I am a wise person. Maybe I've grown in my wisdom. And so we have to take an honest account of these questions for ourselves. The second question you might want to ask is, in what ways do I treat strangers all around me with care, generosity, and fairness, and ultimately with love, of course? Am I a good neighbor to those who I don't know, or am I a bad neighbor? Do I exhibit the qualities of a good friend, or am I only around when the weather is fair, when things are good? And do I see friendships as sort of stepping stones to greater realities, greater hopes and futures, or do I see friendships as ends to themselves for fellowship and joy and for helping one another? You've probably had that friend who has maybe sort of used you only because of what you could give them. And so they may hang out with you because they want to make friends with other people that you know. And once they get to know them, they have no more use for you. I've had this happen in my own life. And so it's important to think about what happens in the relationships that we have with friends, and why are we making friends? And again, there's going to be friendships that just don't last. That's just the nature of it. And it's not always a bad thing. I had friends in college that I would have in classes, but if I didn't have them in my class the next semester, we weren't really still in touch. And that's okay. You don't have to be best friends with everyone. But are you a good friend? Do you stick around even when things get difficult? Another question is, do I fear the Lord and lean not on my own understanding, or do I find my own opinions far superior to any others? So do you have a softness of heart towards God, or do you trust yourself? And in doing all these questions and asking all these questions, we might begin to think of ways we can learn from the wise characters and avoid the ways of the foolish ones. And that's what we ultimately want to do. The last question we'll look at is, according to Proverbs, what is it that separates the foolish, as we've said, from the wise? In other words, why do some people increase in their folly and others flourish in their wisdom? And how can we, if we think we're foolish, how can we then begin to be wise? When it all comes right down to it, what makes the difference between them is simple. The fool, the scoffer on the one hand, I'm reading this wrong. What makes the difference between the simple, the fool, and the scoffer on the one hand and the wise man on the other is simple. The posture of the heart towards God. That's it. That is the whole point of this message here. What makes the difference between foolishness and wisdom? The posture of the heart, as we've seen. Indeed, everyone is invited to receive the Lord's wisdom, and everyone is given an opportunity to obtain it and to possess it. But it is only the fool that seems, or the wise that seems to find it. The fool doesn't care enough to find it, isn't looking for it. By and large, the contrast that pervades the text reveals that wisdom is only found by those who highly value and diligently seek after her. What's at odds here is, again, the posture of the heart. The fools all value their own insight, their own opinions, and their own choices above any other. They look within for all of life's needs and major decisions, but the wise man is very different. Instead, he looks without, knowing that his insight, his opinions, and his choices cannot and should not be trusted above those of God. Thus, he fears the Lord and is softened to his divine authority. And he knows that God uses other people wiser than himself to sharpen him, to counsel him, to advise him, and to push him. Because of this, he seeks and establishes lasting friendships with deep bonds, pursues a wise wife who will help him and his family, and seeks in all his ways to live an upright, virtuous, quiet, and peaceful life under the sovereign care and direction of God, looking then also in all of his ways to the cross, looking to Christ, who is wisdom, as we've seen. In a word then, he fears the Lord. This, as we know, is the beginning and it's the end of wisdom. He looks to the Lord's revelation and he endures the long process of discipleship that it takes to acquire wisdom. This simple posture of the heart makes all the difference in the world. And that is a good summary of what it will take for us to be truly wise. Do we fear the Lord? Do we radically revere him and live our lives trusting him, obeying him, seeking in all ways to glorify him? Or, on the other hand, do we only trust ourselves? Do we only obey our wills, not his? And do we obey and do we follow our own guidance above God's? This could get us into a long conversation about the culture that we find ourselves in today. This is a radically different message than the sort of be yourself message that we find. Proverbs fits perfectly and beautifully with the New Testament picture of discipleship, especially death to self. Paul and Solomon would have been good friends, I think, in this way. They both knew, though Solomon, of course, failed, they both knew that fearing God was the way to wisdom, was the pathway, therefore, to blessing. And so when we follow God, when we pick up our cross, when we die to ourselves, and we see God as being more trustworthy than ourselves, more glorious than ourselves, that is when we will begin to acquire